She didn't wear stars. She didn't give speeches. But when this female officer responded to a general mocking her kill count, the entire Navy fell silent. What she said wasn't loud, but it redefined military leadership in just one sentence. And the ripple effect, it's still being felt. This is more than an inspirational story. It's a wake-up call for anyone who's ever underestimated quiet strength. If you've ever been overlooked or doubted, stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like this need to be heard. The cold hum of the strategy room at Joint Command Pacific had a rhythm to it. Constant. Clinical. As if the machines were breathing in place of the people inside. General Mason Rourke, a decorated Marine with a chest full of medals and a voice that could rattle windows, stood near the central projection table. He was flanked by other brass Army, Navy, Air Force, but his voice was always the loudest. He was mid-laugh when it happened. "Is that her?" he scoffed, jerking his thumb toward a slender woman seated quietly at the rear of the room. "That's the sniper you all keep whispering about." No one answered. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Shaw didn't even look up. She just kept reviewing satellite images, her fingers gliding calmly over her tablet. She wore no expression, no arrogance. Just the blank efficiency of someone who had long since stopped caring about opinions. Rourke wasn't done. "I've killed more men in 2 tours than she's probably seen in her life." That's when she finally spoke. Not loud, not sharp, just clear. "General," she said softly, eyes still on the map. "You count bodies. I count lives saved." The room went still, and nobody laughed after that. The silence that followed Evelyn Shaw's quiet reply hung in the air like suspended dust, weightless. But undeniable. Even the lights seemed to dim slightly. General Rourke chuckled once more. But it didn't land the same way. It wasn't a laugh anymore. It was a defense. "Lives saved," he muttered, pacing to the table. "You sound like one of those psychological operations types, not shooters." Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes weren't defiant, just tired. Like someone who had seen more than most and learned early that explaining yourself to people who didn't want to understand was wasted breath. "I was attached to SEAL Team 9, she said, her voice flat. "I didn't carry a body cam. I wasn't sent to clear buildings. I was tasked with preventing entire missions from turning into body bags." The Air Force colonel next to Rourke cleared his throat. "Wait, SEAL 9, weren't they?" Evelyn gave a slow nod. Classified until last year, now partially declassified due to Joint Command reviews. The room shifted. Everyone had heard whispers. A black unit embedded in enemy territory for 16 months, tasked with real-time target analysis, sniping, counter-intel, and disinformation disruption. Most didn't even believe it was real. Rourke, however, wasn't impressed. "I don't care what unit you were part of," he barked. "I asked how many you took down, not how many radio calls you intercepted." Evelyn paused. She reached into the front pocket of her uniform blouse and pulled out a small, scuffed-up notepad. No one had noticed it before. No one expected someone like her to carry paper in a room full of holograms and high-speed comms. She opened it, flipped to a page near the back, and laid it on the table. There were 9 names. No dates, no numbers, just names. She tapped the list once. Each of them, she said, was a confirmed kill. All high-value targets. Each one had direct command over operations that were planning to detonate IEDs near refugee corridors, field hospitals, or joint humanitarian efforts. She looked up at Rourke. They didn't just die. They were removed from the chain of consequence. Rourke scoffed. 9. That's it. Evelyn didn't flinch. That's 9 attacks that never happened. 9 missions aborted. 9 teams that made it home. 9 groups of civilians who never heard the sound of their own bones breaking under a blast wave. She closed the notebook slowly. "But if it helps you, General, I've probably killed more men than you have medals." A low, stunned breath escaped from someone near the wall. Rourke's jaw tightened, but there was no witty reply this time. No smirk, because in her voice there was no arrogance. Only truth. Captain Jonas, the Navy representative at the far end of the room, finally spoke. Why keep their names? Evelyn blinked once, because they were important, and because they shouldn't be remembered only by the people who hated them. The room stayed silent. It wasn't fear, it wasn't discomfort. It was recalibration. That moment where everyone in the room suddenly realized they had been weighing the wrong things, counting the wrong numbers, listening to the loudest voice instead of the most measured one. Rourke said nothing more for the rest of the meeting. But when it ended, when the chairs scraped back and papers rustled, he paused beside Evelyn's seat. He didn't apologize, but he nodded, and in the language of men like him, that meant something. Evelyn didn't nod back. She didn't need to. She'd already made her point. 2 days after the briefing, Evelyn Shaw received a direct summons, not through her commanding officer, not by chain of command, but through a sealed envelope delivered by a courier who didn't speak a word. The destination was listed simply as War Room Sub-Level Echo. She'd never been there. Most people in uniform didn't even know it existed. The elevator ride was longer than it should have been. Her badge didn't unlock the floor. It was overridden remotely. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped into a narrow corridor lined with blast-proof glass and muted red lights. At the far end of the hall, a reinforced door hissed open. Inside General Rourke. Alone. No aides, no staff, just him. Standing in front of a digital wall filled with still frames, drone footage, infrared scans, live satellite feeds from war zones she recognized but couldn't name. He didn't look up when she entered. "You were right," he said quietly, "about the consequences." Evelyn said nothing. She just waited. He turned toward her, his face older than it looked in daylight. Humbled. Hollow. 2 days ago, we greenlit an op in Barmora province. He began. Intel said it was a weapons cache. Routine sweep, boots on the ground, go loud, get out. Evelyn folded her arms. She already knew where this was going. It wasn't a weapons cache, he admitted. It was a school, a makeshift refugee shelter, kids, women, families. He looked away. We lost 11. They lost 32. Evelyn's jaw clenched slightly, but her expression didn't change. We traced the failure back. He continued. Your name came up. You flagged the location 3 months ago, said it was a soft site under suspected insurgent surveillance, not insurgent control. You recommended deep recon, not direct engagement. Evelyn nodded once. I filed that report 3 times. No response. Rourke sighed. That was on me. A long silence followed. Then he walked over to a console and pulled up a heat map. Red zones, blue zones, the shifting chaos of asymmetric warfare displayed like a storm system on a screen. We're losing this part of the world, he said. Not because we're not strong enough, but because we keep mistaking silence for weakness. He turned back to her. I misjudged you. Thought you were just another analyst in uniform. Quiet, cold, detached. Evelyn finally stepped forward, her voice soft. Silence isn't detachment, sir. It's clarity. Noise gets people killed. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. There's a new unit forming, he said. Joint force signals and precision engagement. Off books. They need someone who can think like the enemy. Someone who sees the pattern before the blood. Evelyn didn't answer right away. What's the mission, she asked. Stop what we did from happening again, Rourke replied. But this time, from the inside. She took a deep breath. This wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a thank you. It was an invitation back into the shadows, where she'd always belonged. Back in her quarters, she sat in the dark, the old notepad in her lap. The page with the 9 names now had a 10th. Not a kill. A mistake. She didn't blame Rourke, not anymore. People like him fought wars they could see. People like her fought the ones no one noticed until it was too late. She closed the book and placed it inside her locker, beside a photo of her original team. All gone now. She picked up the mission file the courier had left outside her door. No name. Just a red wax seal and a single phrase. Silence wins the long war. She opened it and went back to work. The first time General Mason Rourke saw Evelyn Shaw step into a briefing after the Barmora tragedy, something in him shifted. She didn't enter like someone triumphant. She entered like someone accountable. Gone was the silent tension between them. In its place was a strange, mutual understanding, an unspoken recognition that the old rules of hierarchy, of ego and volume, had collapsed in the dust of truth. Rourke had started listening, and it changed everything. Weeks later, Evelyn was in a classified joint op rehearsal deep beneath Naval Command, surrounded by men and women who, months earlier, wouldn't have given her the time of day. Now, they leaned in when she spoke. They asked for her input, not because of her rank, but because of her record, the part no one used to read, the part now echoing through every operation map like a quiet beacon. During a planning session, a young Army major hesitated before presenting a preemptive strike recommendation. He glanced at Evelyn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge him. She just asked, "What happens 2 hours after that?" He blinked. "What fills the vacuum?" she continued. "Who's the second in command? Where do civilians flee? And who takes the blame if we're wrong by 5 feet?" The room was silent. Because in that moment, they weren't planning an op. They were recalibrating a mindset. That was her power. She didn't stop people from pulling the trigger. She made them understand the weight of it. Across the table, General Rourke listened. He wasn't the same man who'd mocked her in the strategy room weeks ago. That version of him had been forged by decades of direct combat close-quarters command. Loud victories, louder losses. But Evelyn had taught him something he'd never been trained to see. The real battlefield isn't always marked by gunfire. Sometimes, it's the quiet moment before the shot. And that battlefield, she commanded like no one else. Later that week, Rourke requested a private sit-down with her. No aides, no notes, just 2 people. "I used to think silence was a void," he admitted, pouring 2 cups of bitter ops room coffee, that it meant someone didn't know what the hell they were doing. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And now?" He took a sip, then gave a dry smile. "Now I know silence is the only space where real judgment can live." She didn't smile back, but she nodded. A small one. He leaned forward. "You should be wearing stars by now." Evelyn shook her head gently. "Stars need to be visible. I do my best work without being seen." Rourke studied her, then said something no one ever expected from him. "I used to command men who kicked down doors," he said. "Now, I know the future belongs to the ones who ask what's behind them first." For a moment, neither spoke. Because neither needed to. That evening, Rourke sent a classified recommendation to the Pentagon. It was brief, clean, no drama. Subject, let's see. CMDR, Evelyn Shaw, request reclassify operational clearance, transfer to strategic advisory role, Tier 1, global oversight. Addendum. If our doctrine is still based on eliminating threats, we need more like her. But if we're ready to start preventing them, we need her. In her quarters, Evelyn stared out the porthole at a still horizon. She didn't need recognition. But the shift She could feel it. They weren't just listening to her anymore. They were changing because of her. 2 weeks later, a jet-black government SUV pulled up beside a nondescript building on the edge of Arlington, Virginia. There was no signage, no guards, just a single steel door, sealed with a biometric lock that read Evelyn Shaw's fingerprint in less than a second. The door clicked open. Inside, the temperature dropped by 5 degrees. No greetings, no salutes, just a narrow hallway and a small briefing room already humming with encrypted displays. She was no longer Lieutenant Shaw. She was now Advisor 01. A man she didn't recognize stood by the table, a gray-suited civilian with defense intel credentials and a demeanor like cold steel. He introduced himself only as Director Harlan. "You've been cleared for Operation Cradle," he said, tapping a tablet that projected a map filled with red veins stretching across Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. "You'll be advising all joint branches, direct access, no middle layers." She said nothing. He studied her a moment, then added, "You'll work where the next wars are fought before they begin, before blood stains anything." It wasn't a promotion, it was a mission. And Evelyn understood the weight of it. 3 days into her new role, she was flown to an undisclosed base where 5 global generals sat waiting around a circular briefing table. Each had command over tens of thousands of lives. Each had spent decades fighting wars in different uniforms, under different flags. Evelyn walked in, wearing a plain black tactical blouse, no insignia, no nameplate. She laid out a single file. One of the generals, a French officer with sharp eyes, asked the question first. "How many have you killed?" Evelyn looked up and smiled, just barely. "None," she said. "Not this year." The silence was familiar now. She thrived in it. Because they still didn't understand, not yet, that her power wasn't in the shot fired. It was in the one never taken. She opened the file. It detailed an insurgent leader known as Khalid Wren, believed to be organizing a coordinated attack across multiple countries, using drone swarms disguised as civilian cargo fleets. "They want us to bomb the holding site in Garaja," one general said. "Take out the logistics. Destroy the threat." Evelyn tapped the screen, enlarging a data node. "You do that," she said, "and you'll kill 300 civilians being held as human shields in the lower levels." The room went still. She continued, voice flat, factual. "If you wait 12 more hours, Wren will move them to a known checkpoint. One of our deep cells will intercept." One of the generals leaned forward. "How do you know he'll move them?" Evelyn met his eyes. "Because I wrote the radio script that will make him think the site's been compromised." They didn't speak for a moment. Then, one by one, each of them leaned back in their chairs. The decision was made. Not by a vote, not by shouting, but by a single woman who understood that timing, pressure, and silence could shift the outcome of a war more than any missile. After the meeting, General Rourke called her from across the ocean. He didn't waste time. "Are you in it now?" he asked. She looked out the window of her temporary quarters. She could see the lights of the city beyond the barbed wire families. Laughter. Lives that had no idea how close they'd come to chaos. "I've always been in it," she said quietly. "Now I just don't have to ask permission." He chuckled. Not mocking. This time, proud. "You're rewriting the book, Evelyn." She didn't answer right away. Then, "No," she said. "I'm just erasing the lines that never should have been written." And with that, she turned back to her screen. Another incoming alert, blinking silently. The war hadn't ended. But the way it was fought had just changed. 6 months into her new assignment, Evelyn Shaw's name wasn't spoken in most rooms. But her fingerprints were everywhere. Operations that used to start with shock and awe now began with patterns, threads she'd traced back through months of silent observation. She didn't walk onto battlefields anymore. She walked ahead of them. She had become a shadow behind command decisions, a calm voice at the edge of chaos. To some, she was a ghost. To others, a myth. But for the people who mattered, the ones who wore stars on their collars and actually listened, Evelyn was something else entirely. Essential. It wasn't power that had changed her. It was clarity. In one particular briefing, a young cyber intel captain fumbled a report on a suspected drone strike pattern. It was messy, full of guesswork. Everyone in the room dismissed it until Evelyn asked for the raw data. She spent 2 hours decoding it herself. The result, an intercepted attack on a Red Cross convoy in Kimbara province. 50 lives saved. She didn't thank the captain in public. She found him later, slid the declassified summary across his desk. "You saw what they didn't," she said. "Next time, speak louder." The young officer never forgot that moment. Not because she praised him, but because she trusted him to grow. Evelyn never raised her voice. But people leaned forward when she spoke. They adjusted their language, checked their assumptions. She changed the culture around her not with force, but with presence. That was her power. And it had taken her years to understand that her silence was never weakness. It was discipline. One evening, she sat alone in her temporary quarters, sipping black coffee and reviewing intercepted chatter from a northern corridor in Maresh province. The patterns were familiar. Too familiar. She leaned back, exhaled, then reached for her notebook, the same small, worn leather one she'd carried since the beginning. There were now 12 names written inside. She paused. On the next page, she wrote a word she hadn't used before. Prevention. No kill, no target. Just the ripple she had stopped from ever touching the shore. The next day, she was called to a civilian oversight panel at the Pentagon, a formality. They wanted to review operational effectiveness of her new role. She walked in alone. The panel asked for metrics, measurable outcomes, visible impact. One of them asked, "How can we justify the resources behind a position that doesn't directly engage?" Evelyn stared at him, then asked, "How do you measure the sound of a bomb that never goes off?" He didn't answer, but he didn't speak again either. The report was approved. Funding extended. Her role solidified. Later that evening, she got an encrypted call from Rourke. "I saw the transcripts," he said. "You shut them down." "I didn't." She replied, "They shut themselves down. I just let the silence speak first." He laughed softly, a far cry from the man who once barked at everyone in the room. "You know, 6 months ago, I wouldn't have understood that." "I know," she said. "You weren't supposed to—" He paused, then said something she didn't expect. "You've changed the way I lead, Evelyn." She didn't reply immediately. Then, "Good," she said. "Because leading isn't about who speaks first. It's about who listens best." That night, Evelyn updated her notebook one more time. Not with a name, but with a sentence. Influence is the quiet correction of violent momentum. And somewhere across the world, a mission was rerouted. A convoy was delayed. A child made it to school the next day instead of being written into a casualty report. She would never know their names. But that wasn't the point. The point was they were still alive. And that was enough. It was nearly midnight when Evelyn Shaw stood alone at the observation deck of the Command Intelligence Annex, 12 stories above a city that had no idea who she was. Below her, life pulsed on in soft streetlights, couples walking home, taxis weaving through intersections, late-night runners moving with headphones and peace. All of it oblivious. All of it safe. And that was the entire point. A soft chime sounded behind her. The door opened. Footsteps. She didn't turn. "I figured I'd find you here," said a familiar voice. General Mason Rourke stepped beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "I owe you about 1,000 of these," he said, handing one over. Evelyn took it silently. He stared out the glass next to her. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were cold," he said. "Detached. Dangerous in the wrong way." She glanced at him. "And now?" He shook his head, eyes still on the city. "Now I know you're dangerous in the only way that matters." She didn't smile, but there was warmth in her silence. They stood like that for a long time, two people who had once stood on opposite sides of an invisible war. Then Rourke spoke again. "We had a vote today," he said. "Top brass. They want to formalize the position you've carved out, make it part of the training pipeline, teach younger officers how to think before they act." Evelyn took a sip of her coffee. "About time," she said. He chuckled. "They want to name the doctrine after you." She turned now, finally looking at him. "No," she said. "Why not?" he asked. "You earned it." "Because the moment you put a name on it," she said softly, "people think it's a method, a checklist. What I do isn't a system, it's a mindset." Rourke studied her, nodding slowly. He understood. This wasn't about glory. Never had been. When he left, Evelyn stayed. She stood at the window long after the lights dimmed in the annex. She thought of her first field op. The first shot she didn't take. The first time she saved someone by not pulling a trigger. She remembered the silence after. It was the same silence that had filled that war room when Rourke mocked her. It was the same silence that came after she spoke. And now, it was the silence of a city breathing freely because no one knew how close they'd come to losing it. Later, back in her quarters, she opened her notebook again. She didn't write a name, didn't write a sentence. She just flipped back through every entry, 12 names, countless events, maps, decisions, redirected missions, lives not lost. Then she turned to the last page and wrote 2 words, "Still listening?" Because Evelyn Shaw didn't need a statue. She didn't need a title. She didn't even need to be remembered. She just needed people to listen before acting, to see before striking, to understand before commanding. And in a world full of noise, she had become the loudest voice in the room by learning when not to speak. That was her legacy. And it was already echoing in officers around the world who would never know her name, but who would carry her discipline into every war they never had to fight. True power isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear medals or shout commands in war rooms. Sometimes, power is the quiet voice that speaks last and speaks only when it matters. Evelyn Shaw taught us that strength isn't measured in body counts or battlefield scars. It's found in restraint, in discipline, in the courage to stay silent while others clamor for credit. She didn't seek revenge, recognition, or approval. They don't fight for applause. They fight for outcomes. And that kind of quiet leadership changes everything. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell. Quiet strength deserves to be heard. Share it with someone who leads by listening. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.